Pattern Company, and this is the Hughes Dress Sew Along. This is video 1 of 2, and in this video we're going to go over the construction of the bodice, and then the second video will be assembling the bodice and the skirt and the finishing touches, but don't worry about that now. So we're going to be doing a bunch more videos like this, and if that's your thing, like and subscribe. This video is meant to accompany the written instructions that were included in your pattern, so the start of this you should already have your pieces cut out. Yeah, we move kind of quickly through the steps, so feel free to pause the video, come back, rewind, whatever you have to do. And the only thing to note that'll be different about the version I'm making is that I'm making it out of corduroy, which is a beautiful fabric and I love it, but it is a little bit different because you can't press it. It has a nap, so you don't want to press fabrics that have naps because it's almost like disrupting its hair. So you'll see me finger pressing in this video, in some of the videos, so it's like, it is a thing, and it's basically just kind of like, you know, to the seams. So I use like a ruler or my hand to just press the seams flat, and yeah, that'll be different if you're using a fabric that can be pressed, which will make it easier and it'll look tidier for you. I'm also not using a serger to finish seams in this, and I'll go over how to do a clean seam finish with your sewing machine. And yeah, I think that's it. So happy sewing!
So here we have our pieces for ready to sew. I've fused the interfacing onto the lining instead of the main fabric just because you can't really press onto corduroy. And it's hard to see here, but I've marked little button marks along the front that we'll use later when we're ready to sew buttons. So first we're going to stay stitch around the necklines on the lining and the main fabric. So here we are at the sewing machine to do our stay stitching. So we've got a 3.5mm long stitch that's a little bit longer than a normal one, and I'm sewing a 1/4 inch from the edge. And the stay stitch will just protect the curved necklines from getting stretched out kind of while we're assembling the pieces. So you'll do both of your center front pieces and your center back pieces just around that neckline. So for our first sewing steps, we're going to prep the tie and the tabs, and this is done in the same way. For this version, because it's hard to make a tube out of corduroy and flip it, I'm actually folding the two ends in and pinning them, and then I'm going to edge stitch near that folded edge. So in the instructions, it actually has you turn this right sides together and sew, and then turn it using a loop turner, which gives you a really clean finish, and that's good for fabrics that are turnable, which I would say that corduroy is not turnable, especially for like such a small tube. So that's what I'm doing here. So now that that's all pinned, we're just gonna edge stitch along this edge, and we'll just get in close right there and stitch. And again, it's the same process for sewing the tab piece and the tie piece. So I'm just showing you one of those here. Sewing along. Here's our tab piece all sewn up, and we will go ahead and cut this into 6 3-inch pieces. I don't know about you, but I like to use pieces to cut other pieces rather than cutting with a ruler for all of them. Yeah, I mean, the ruler works too, but you know. So here's your center back piece D and your tabs. And we're just going to clip those in place. You've got little notches cut back here, and the tabs fit perfectly in between the little notches. So just fold them in half, and yeah, I'm using clips here, but pins work as well. And then once we have them all in place, we're going to baste stitch them along the edges just to secure them before we join our center back to our side backs. So here we have those pieces basted in place, and we'll grab our side back C's and we will pin them along that thing, and you've got notches on your side backs as well that you can match up to make sure this is all going into place. Once that's all pinned, you're just going to sew along the seam with your 3/8 inch seam allowance on both sides. So there we have it, and we're going to press those seams open, and these tabs go in towards the center back. Let's make the front of the bodice. So that's your center front A and your side front B, and those will get pinned together. You can match these notches. And then once those are all pinned together, we're going to sew along this seam at a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you'll repeat on both sides. Cool, so you've got that seam done, and now we're going to clip around this seam because it's curved and we want it to lay flat. So you're just going to trim into the seam allowance without cutting through the seam, and then we're going to press it open. Just repeat that on both sides. And then we can lay our front pieces on right sides together with our back bodice, and now we'll attach them at the side seams. So again, you're just going to use your 3/8 inch seam allowance here. Coolio! So we've got our side seams sewn and pressed open, and now we're going to do our shoulder seams. So just match those up and we'll stitch them. So you've got your main bodice assembled at this point, and you're going to repeat those steps with your lining bodice pieces. And you're going to prepare the lining to be joined to the main fabric of the bodice. So do a basting stitch 3/8 of an inch around the armholes and trim into it and press it under. So here I have that done. So we sewed 3/8 of an inch around, we trimmed in so that we could press it under flat, and then you press the hem of the lining under 3/8 of an inch. So now we're going to set this aside and work on the sleeves. So grab your sleeve piece and notice that you'll have a couple notches up towards the top of the sleeve, and we are going to add long straight stitches between those. So your first row will be a 1/4 inch from the edge, and then the next row will be a 1/4 inch from that. Here I have them sewn. These are so that we can gather the cap of the sleeve in. So next up, we are going to sew the underarm seam of our sleeve. So after you have that sewn, we're going to press it open, and this seam needs to be finished. So I'll show you how that's done. We're going to use a zigzag stitch, and we're going to sew on each of those sides. So I'm putting my zigzag stitch right on the edge so that one side, the needle goes off of the fabric, and this will create a nice clean finish. Obviously, if you have like a serger or a different way you'd like to finish this seam, you're more than welcome. I'm just showing this because I think it's probably the easiest. And voila, looks great. Now we will pin the sleeve into the bodice. So there's a single and a double notch down there, and the single notch goes to the front of the bodice and the double notch goes to the back of the bodice. So right sides together, pin your sleeve to your bodice, and we're going to make sure that these seams are pressed open, and we'll match that single notch on the front of the bodice with the single notch on the sleeve, and then keep pinning up. And I kind of like to work my way up towards the cap of the sleeve because I know that there's gathers up there, so those double notches match. And then we'll work our way up, and I'm kind of stopping pinning where that gathering stitch starts on both sides. And then the gathering stitches will be pulled to make this match the length of the arm side on the bodice. So just gently pull to gather and kind of move it around with your fingers until it feels right. Move to that clip so that I could get into that very top part at the shoulder seam, and you're going to repeat on the front and back. And I like to concentrate the gathers up at the top of the sleeve cap because I think that gives like a nice little poof. And you can add that back in and get ready to sew. And there it is. Ooh, so now we'll clip this seam and press it in towards the bodice. I'm gonna remove these stickers now because I've got this assembled, and we're gonna add the lining in. So here's our lining, and we're gonna attach it at the neckline first. So right sides together, pin them together, matching it up around the neckline, and your shoulder seams should match. You can stick your sleeve in just to kind of see what you're doing here. Once you get that ready, we're just going to use our regular seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch to go all the way around. Here it is stitched. Now we're going to clip the curves of this neckline so that it lays really nicely. So again, just snip into your seam allowance without snipping through your seam. This is going to give you a nice finish. Now we'll understitch the seam allowance to the lining. So that means we push the seam allowance towards the lining and we sew on the lining 1/8 inch from the edge. So here we have it understitched, and you can see that stitch up there, that holds the lining down so that it doesn't roll forward and show on your finished garment. Now we're going to sew the center fronts of the bodice together. So flip it back around, right sides together, and this seam allowance is going to point down on the lining side. And remember, you have the hem of your lining is pressed up 3/8 of an inch. So we're going to keep that press, and we're going to stitch from there to there. Here's that seam sewn, and we're going to clip off that corner. And this did not work. I don't know, my fellow lefties, if you have problems with snips, but I always end up having to use my scissors. I think it's because my snips aren't actually left-handed, so they're mostly just good for snipping threads. But anyway, so snip off those corners and then flip it right side out. Okay, so we'll understitch this as well. So we're pushing the seam allowance towards the lining, and we're gonna stitch up towards this corner at our bodice, but we won't go all the way to the corner. So we're just gonna go up as far as we can. And here is that understitching. So you can see, and you can see that I only stitch up to about here, and we still get a nice corner, and we're gonna keep our lining from popping out, but we didn't go all the way up into that corner because it'll warp our fabric and get messy. Anyway, so you'll do that on both sides. All right, this next part's a little tedious, but it's gonna leave us with a gorgeous finish, so it's worth it. So we have that seam on our lining where we basted 3/8 of an inch from the edge, and we're matching that seam up with the seam where our sleeve is joined to our bodice. And we're just pinning that in place all the way around. And this is preparing so that we can sew this sleeve shut. This seam, sorry, not sleeve, seam shut. And the instructions prompt you to do this by hand, and I think that that is definitely the nicest finish. If you really wanted to, you could stitch in the ditch using your machine, but it doesn't actually take that long to sew by hand, and it's just like a perfect invisible finish. So let's do that. So once you get everyone pinned perfectly into place, you're going to thread up a hand sewing needle, and you're going to sew the lining in place around the armhole. So I'm catching on the lining, I'm just catching right on that line where we sewed that basting stitch early on. It's kind of our guide, and I'm matching it up with the seam where the sleeve is joined to the bodice, but I'm only sewing on like that seam allowance. I'm not catching the main fabric. So this finish is going to be completely invisible once it's done, and it's going to look so beautiful. You're obviously going to do this on both sleeves, so I don't know, maybe turn on a show or listen to a podcast while you do it. Great, so that's done. And we've got this gorgeous looking bodice, and the last thing we need to do is hem our sleeves. So those just get turned up twice, turned under twice, 3/8 of an inch. So I have a little seam gauge here, and if you were using regular fabric, you would press this, but again, I can't really press corduroy. So I've made this project a lot harder for myself. So I'm just turning it under twice and kind of pressing it into place with my hands and using a lot of clips. And then once you have this all prepped, you're gonna edge stitch an 1/8 inch from the folded edge. I like to sew that with the folded edge facing up so you can see where you're at. Awesome, so there that is, and you'll do it on both sides. And yeah, that is the bodice. Now we're gonna join it to the skirt, but honestly, the hardest part's done. So next week we will be assembling the skirt, attaching the bodice, and putting the finishing touches on our Hughes dresses. So I hope this video was helpful for you, and yeah, see you next week. Bye.